Welcome to the London Luminaries lecture series. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm from Marble Hill, and it is a delight to be working with 12 wonderful organisations celebrating our collective heritage. It is with great delight that I would like to introduce tonight our wonderful speaker and our chair, Professor Judith Hawley. She's a broadcaster, a lecturer and a historian, and it's great to have her here. Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction, and welcome to those of you who are listening in live, and welcome to those of you joining us later on YouTube. I want to begin by offering thanks to Rachel, Robert, Ricky, Angela, and all those behind the scenes who've made this series possible. And also to thank you, the audience, who through your generosity, you've supported these 12 historic houses, and a delight to be able to speak to you today. Now, this lecture series is the third one we've done. It builds on the success of previous series, the Twickenham Luminaries and the Thames Luminaries, and recordings of those previous programmes are up on YouTube as well. But why the Luminaries? This area of the River Thames was a magnet for creative and influential people, especially during the 18th century, due to its proximity to London, which was the centre of an expanding empire. The riverfront from Hampton to Richmond attracted royalty, aristocrats, artists, writers, and wealthy property owners. The legacy of the Luminaries was a rich tapestry of connections of poets, painters, politicians, and princes that made the area the place to be. We will be exploring these treasures further in a talk about what we call Twickenhamshire as part of the Richmond Literary Festival on the 11th of November. Please see our Luminaries website for details of all of these talks. Now, let me now introduce our speaker. Rachel Mackay is the manager of historic royal palaces at Kew, which includes Kew Palace, Queen Charlotte's Cottage, the Royal Kitchens, and the Great Pagoda. These buildings are normally open to the public from April to September, so you've just missed an opportunity to see her highly regarded exhibition on George III, The Mind Behind the Myth. This exhibition was recently recognised by the International Museum Industry website, Blue Loop, for its achievement of innovation in inclusion. Her future projects include the world's first Eurovision Museum in Iceland. Over to you, Rachel Mackay.
Thank you very much, Judith, for that introduction. I am very pleased to be here giving this first in the series of the London Luminaries talks and to tell you all about Kew. As Judith mentioned, I'm the manager of Historic Royal Palaces at Kew, which means that it's my privilege to look after 4 buildings inside the Royal Botanic Gardens. So I work for the same charity that looks after the Tower of London and Hampton Court, etc. But I'm based at Kew Gardens. And the 4 buildings at Kew that we look after are Kew Palace, which was an active royal residence up until 1818, and the Royal Kitchens building, which served both Kew Palace and the White House, which was the primary royal residence at Kew up until 1818. We also have at the other end of the garden, we have a thatched cottage known as Queen Charlotte's Cottage. And last, but certainly by no means least, we have a Great Pagoda, which we completed our restoration project on in 2018 and opened it up to the public. This year, we're normally open, as Judith said, from April to September, this 2020 being a slight aberration there. But this year we opened a special exhibition called George III, The Mind Behind the Myth, which focused on George III and his mental illness, trying to separate this remarkable man with a remarkable mind, really, from the myth and often in popular culture, the joke that his ill health has sadly become. And that's going to be the subject of my talk this evening. So Kew Palace is most famous, of course, as the home to George III, his Queen Charlotte and their 15 children, although it is, of course, important to note that in the UK's smallest palace, they probably would not have lived there all at the same time. In fact, Kew Palace played several different roles throughout the lifetime of King George. First of all, it was a schoolhouse for himself and his brother, where he was taught, amongst other things, geometry and architecture. And these are some of the objects that we had on display in the palace this year and just show the breadth of his education and knowledge. He, of course, had the best education available. So he was taught architecture by Sir William Chambers, who was the brains behind the Great Pagoda. And and many of the other follies that were commissioned at Kew by Princess Augusta, who was George's mother, as part of the wider development of Kew Gardens. So we also know that he was interested in books, and you might have seen at the British Library his collection of over 65,000 books that's at the heart of the British Library, but also book binding. So these are the book binding tools that we had on display this year, and he was fascinated by how things fit together, and he used to conduct scientific experiments at the weekends and spend his free hours taking watches apart and clocks apart and putting them back together again. So from all of that, we can surmise that Kew served George well as a schoolhouse. The next phase of the palace was as a summer holiday home for his wife and growing family. And this was a time that he spent expanding the estate at Kew and making his beloved agricultural experiments, such as introducing merino sheep to the area. The family were fond of the site, referring to it as Little Kew. It was a peaceful retreat out of London, but also actually several public roads ran through the garden site at that time. And so it was also a place where George could chat to the common man, which he enjoyed doing, and was often seen stopping people on the road to have a chat, probably much to the consternation of the common man. And then the third role that Kew played in George's life was a much sadder one. Kew had started to fall out of favour anyway, as George became more involved and more invested in the improvements that he was making at Windsor, and the White House was falling into disrepair. But its location as being outside of London, away from prying eyes at court, meant that it was the ideal place for George to go for treatment and recovery during his famous periods of mental and physical ill health. So the first symptoms of the king's illness came with no indication of the serious crisis that was to follow, really. He had stomach upsets, or as he called them, pretty smart bilious attacks, in the summer of 1788 when he was 50 years old. And it was recommended that to solve this, he spend a month at Cheltenham taking the waters, and after that, everything seemed fine. However, the bilious attacks returned on Friday, the 17th of October, along with pains in the legs. The king's doctor, George Baker, put these symptoms down to the fact that His Majesty rose early as usual, walked on the grass several hours, and without having changed his stockings, which were very wet to St. James's, and that at night he ate 4 large pears for supper. Who amongst us hasn't? However, within days, the king had developed new symptoms, including a rash, a fever, a pain in his left foot. There was also symptoms that seemed that they were more psychological than physical, such as an ability to concentrate and a tendency to ramble. Over the next few weeks, these symptoms sometimes lessened and sometimes increased. And we can see from the diaries and the letters of the household that the stress was really beginning to affect the family. Fanny Burney, for example, who is the novelist, but at the time she was also the keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte. She wrote that the Queen grows more and more uneasy. She alarms me sometimes for herself, and at other times she has a sedateness that wonders me still more. By this time, the king's mental health became public knowledge. After an embarrassing incident where the king insulted many at court, Earl Stanhope commented, "Here then was the turning point. This was the precise moment when ceased the dominion of a sovereign over his subjects, and when began, on the contrary, the dominion of sound minds over an unsound one. Here then let history pause." But of course, history doesn't pause, because the business of the realm still has to continue. George's health was not only a personal crisis, but a political one as well. And that can be seen in every aspect of his care, really. Parliament, for example, couldn't be opened without the king. So as early as November, talk was beginning to turn to appointing a regent. And one person who was particularly keen on this appointment was, of course, the Prince of Wales himself, who felt very strongly that the budget he had allocated was not sufficient to meet his needs. The prince's interests were represented in the medical sense by his own physician, Dr. Warren. And Dr. Warren would attend the king and produce reports that suggested that, in fact, he was not likely to recover. There were these regular bulletins produced about the king's health almost every day. But because you had the king's doctors and Warren arguing over the diagnosis, they were often very vaguely worded, and treatments were never wholly agreed on. So in some ways, George was lucky to be a king. He could afford the best treatment available, and his illness forced doctors in a way to start taking psychiatry seriously. But on the other hand, when every party has a vested interest in your recovery or your demise, can your treatment ever be truly objective? In fact, it's certain that the lack of coordination and management from the team of doctors made George's condition worse. In addition, the treatments themselves were hardly likely to do much good. Although medical science was beginning to advance, most physicians still relied on the system of humours, and so believed that you had to get your various bodily fluids in good balance in order to achieve good health. So most of the treatments that he had, such as eating various herbs and vegetables, were likely to be pretty useless. And some of them, like bleeding, leeching and blistering, would have been physically harmful, as well as, of course, extremely emotionally distressing. I just want to flag up now that I'm going to be talking about the use of restraint, which can be a difficult topic. I'm going to use images of some documents, but I won't be showing any images of restraints themselves, because that isn't something that we would do at Kew Palace, because in putting this exhibition together, we worked with people who had experience of mental ill health, and we really wanted to consider their needs and their well-being throughout. So we do know that restraint was used with George. He would have been put in something that's referred to in these letters as a straight waistcoat. Obviously, we would call it a straitjacket. And this was used when he became uncontrollable, but also it was often just used as a punishment, really, for bad behavior. And he also had a chair that he could be strapped into, which he himself ironically referred to as his coronation chair. And if you've seen the film The Madness of King George, you might remember that scene. It's very sort of famous and affecting, where he's strapped into this chair whilst they're playing Zadok the priest in the background. And it really just underlines how far George had fallen in his own estimation and how humiliated he must have felt at that time. But despite his condition, he did recover. So there was no need at that time to appoint a regent. And at Kew, because we have the royal kitchens as well, we also have the records of the clerk of the kitchens. And we have the orders that he was putting through for Kew, where the king was at this time. So we know that the 6th of February, 1789 was the first day that George was allowed to use his own knife and fork. We also know what he was served for dinner that evening, and the menu included rabbit, spinach, omelettes, barley soup, and partridges. So the king was now lucid, but heartbreakingly, he retained his memories of the state that he'd been in. And in a letter to the Prime Minister, he wrote, "I have been ill for 17 weeks. I must have lost some friends in that time." And this is something that many of the people in our community engagement work really sympathize with, that the fear that people would react badly to behavior that isn't really in your control. And we also know that when George recovered, he sacked many of the servants who had been with him during that time, possibly because he felt that he'd been seen in a way that no monarch should ever be seen. So the nation rejoiced, and we have on display at Kew some of the items that were created to celebrate the king's return to health, including this saucer, which says on it, "Huzzah, the king is well." However, we know, of course, that the king was not really cured for good. He had several recurring episodes of ill health, most notably in 1801 and 1804, before his final decade of illness in 1810. And actually, when we talk about him coming to Kew during these periods of illness, we're often actually talking about different buildings. So sometimes it can be quite confusing when you're looking at the sources, because Kew Palace, as in the current Kew Palace, was formerly known as the Dutch House. And then the White House, which I mentioned earlier and is here, is often referred to in the sources as Kew Palace. So sometimes it can be quite confusing as to what palace they're actually referring to. However, we're pretty sure that in 1788, so that first period of illness, the White House was still the primary residence at Kew, and that is probably where the king would have been. In 1801 and 1804, the White House was in very poor repair. In fact, it was knocked down in 1802. So the king was more likely to be housed in the Dutch House, or what is now known as Kew Palace. And in fact, we do know that one of the defining moments of the crisis happened in the dining room at Kew Palace, underneath the portrait of Van Dyck that you can see above the fireplace there. When he was there in 1801, the king wanted to leave the palace, and his doctor, Francis Willis, tricked him into staying by asking him to tell him about that portrait. The king tried to leave, but was stopped by the doctor's men who blocked the door, and he realized that he was essentially a prisoner. And he told Willis that he would never forgive him as long as he lived. In 1804, there was a more serious episode of ill health that brought him back to Kew, and again led to the use of restraints. And visitors who come to the palace often want to know where the king was kept. during this time. And the fact is that the king's apartments were actually in this section of the palace, which doesn't exist anymore. It's tempting to consider why this 19th century demolition occurred, and it's especially tempting to think that Victoria, who resented any mention of her grandfather's illness when she was alive, wouldn't have wanted those rooms on display to the public when she gave it over to the public. We don't really know, of course, but the fact that that door now opens onto what is essentially a brick wall is an absolute gift for me when I'm doing a tour, and I like to refer to it as the perfect metaphor for the Victorian attitude towards mental health. The king's final illness began in 1810 when his youngest daughter, Amelia, died of TB, and this was a trauma that seemed to push him over the edge, and he never regained his health after that. The Prince of Wales was finally appointed regent in 1811, and George lived out the rest of his days at Windsor, eventually losing his sight and his hearing and spending his time playing the flute and conversing with long dead friends and family. One of his doctors wrote that he had lost all interest in this world, and he was in his own world. He wasn't told when his wife, Queen Charlotte, died at Kew Palace in 1818, and then he himself died 2 years later. So, what is the legacy of King George III's illness? In medical terms, George had two quite immediate, significant effects on psychiatry. The first one I've already mentioned around how psychiatric illness was dealt with. So prior to George being ill, mentally ill patients were poorly understood and poorly dealt with. And patients could be sent off to asylums just on the say-so of one doctor, if that. And the goal was often really just to warehouse them rather than to actually treat them. The fact that now a king was ill, it forced doctors to take psychiatry seriously, and it opened up a whole new field of research and development going forward. And then the second impact George had was actually not to do with his own illness, but linked to an incident that happened back in 1786, when a woman named Margaret Nicholson made a half-hearted and unsuccessful attempt on the king's life with a butter knife. And George's insistence that she not be punished because she wasn't of sound mind led to the first time in English law that there was a distinction made between criminal and criminally insane. And I always find it quite moving that he had that positive impact on the lives of people who were dealing with mental ill health before he had any sign of any symptoms himself. Of course, in historical terms, the big question that people have always asked is what exactly was wrong with George? And the diagnosis that most people are familiar with is, and is in fact in the film, The Madness of King George, is porphyria. And porphyria is a group of liver disorders in which substances called porphyrins, I might not be pronouncing that correctly, build up in the body and negatively affect the skin or the nervous system. It can cause psychological problems as well as physiological, but it is essentially a physical illness rather than a mental illness. And this diagnosis first came about in 1969 in a book called George III and the Mad Business by Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter. And there are several reasons that they give for this diagnosis, one of them being that his urine turned blue. Actually, there's several medical reasons that something like that can happen. And contemporary historians now are really questioning that porphyria diagnosis. It might have been that porphyria, being a physical condition, seemed a more palatable solution in the 1960s at a time where society wasn't willing to accept or admit that a member of the royal family could have a mental illness. I guess it's a point of debate whether this is still the case. However, many contemporary historians and doctors, including our curators here at Historic Royal Palaces, think that it's more likely that the king was living with a mental health condition, such as bipolar disorder, combined with extreme manic episodes. And some of the reasons for this are his incessant talking, which can be a symptom of the manic end of bipolar, and the fact that there was often some trauma involved with the onset of his illness, such as, for example, the death of Princess Amelia in 1810. George did undoubtedly experience some physical symptoms as well, but it might be that some of these were actually caused by the doctor's treatments, which, as I've described, were pretty brutal. All of this leads us on to how we talk about George's illness today, and that's a very question we've been considering at Kew Palace as we've been putting this exhibition together. So obviously vocabulary has changed, and so we no longer refer to George's madness in quotes, but instead his periods of mental and physical ill health. And we try to move people away from the mystery solving aspect of the history whatever was wrong with George, one thing that most contemporary doctors agree on is that we cannot and probably should not attempt to diagnose someone across a void of 200 years. So in the exhibition, we focused more on his experience of illness and the experience of those around them. And we've used expert help where possible, including a group of people who all have experience of living with mental ill health. And we did this in two ways. Firstly, by asking them to look at some of the objects that we had on display, some of the historic objects, and interpret them in a way that links to their own experience. And also by asking people to loan objects to a contemporary exhibition on the top floor of the palace, which tells the story of contemporary Londoners' mental health in exactly the same way that we talk about George. And you can see that we've got some of those objects there. If you did miss the exhibition and you would like to find out more, you can head to the Kew Palace website and you'll be able to see videos from some of our contemporary lenders talking about their objects. While we were discussing the exhibition with our community group, and here they are on a field trip to Windsor, one of the things they brought up was that for them, it feels like diagnosis is often more important for other people. So obviously it's important that they get the right treatment, but they felt that other people needed to be able to label them, to understand them, that other people feel more comfortable with that. If it's something they can Google, people feel like they can understand it and they're comfortable with it, even though it doesn't really necessarily change anything about their own experience. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. And it really links back to that question of, what was wrong with George? Why are we so desperate to diagnose him? Is it something to do with making ourselves feel more comfortable about it? So those are the questions that we have been asking ourselves in this exhibition at Kew this year. And I have to say the feedback we've received has been amazing. And I think that feedback has really shown that we have changed how people think about George III specifically, and in some cases about mental health in general. As I mentioned, the exhibition is closed now, but as I mentioned, we have lots of information, lender videos, and lots of photographs of some of our objects on our website. So I've included some links on this last slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that amazing talk. I was really impressed by the way in which you're bridging past and present, and thinking about how we understand the experience now. I'm getting some wonderful comments, a fabulous presentation, and lots of questions. So I'm going to put some of these questions together. I think some of them, as they were coming up, I felt that you're answering them, but I think there are a couple of things that I'd like to sort of help people get their bearings with first, by talking about the buildings and the gardens, and then I'll pick out some more of the questions about George's experience and what it means to us now. So you mentioned the White House, the extent of the White House, and the relationship between in a way the Red House and the White House. Could you go over again or say a bit more about which house George was in as a child, which was he educated in, when did he move into the Dutch house, and so on?
Yeah, so the White House was really the first royal residence at Kew, and it was lived in by Queen Caroline and George II, but also Prince Frederick and Princess Augusta when they were Prince and Princess of Wales. So that was really the primary royal residence. Kew Palace, and by that I mean the Dutch house that I look after now, that was actually built by Samuel Fortrey, a Flemish merchant in 1631, and the lease was taken over by Queen Caroline when she essentially just needed some more space for her teenage daughters. So it was essentially a crash pad for her teenage girls, and so that became a kind of extension of the royal estate. So throughout the years, they used both palaces. I would say the White House continued to be the primary residence, as I said, but it started to go into disrepair. George had an idea to build a castellated palace, and he started to build it, in fact. And so the idea was that would replace the White House. And he started building it, but sort of gave up on it. And the bit that was built was so well built that George IV had to blow it up with dynamite. And it's a shame that it's not there today, obviously. But the Kew Palace was never really intended to be the primary royal residence. As I mentioned, it was the schoolhouse for George and his brother, and then it became a family home, and then really it was being used for the king and also for Queen Charlotte when she was in her last days, because it was really the only residence left at Kew that was able to be lived in. The White House was in such disrepair by that time, and so they had to kind of go to Kew, and it was never somewhere they intended to be in the winter. And I can tell you from personal experience that it's not a winter palace, but it was always meant to be a summer palace. But it kind of was just the only place there was, I guess, in those final days.
Thank you so much. And that leads to another set of questions about the space, the gardens, and how public they were. Because nowadays, of course, we can visit, we can walk in the gardens, that they're really run as a publicly accessible site. But how private was it then? How close could people get to the king when he was ill and when he was not ill?
Yeah, that's the thing. We always think of it as this sort of secluded space, but actually there were public roads that ran through it. I guess when we talk about seclusion and privacy, what we really probably mean is away from central London and away from the court and away from the fashionable people who would talk about it. We know that he did roam around the gardens and he was taken out for walks. And he, for example, we know that he went to the pagoda one day demanding to be let in, and they refused him entry, and he sort of had to be carried back to Kew Palace. So we know that he had, a fairly free run of the gardens at that time, and there would have been people coming through. We can only really speculate as to what people saw, I guess. He was sort of being looked after quite closely, by the second team of doctors that came in. So he would have been quite restricted in that way as well.
Can you say some more about the doctors? Because they do seem to be an interesting team. And I remember looking at the last days of Queen Anne, and how, the Whig doctors are saying, oh, she's not going to last long, we'd better bring in the Elector. But the Tories are saying, no, she's fine, she's absolutely fine. They're briefing against each other. I mean, were there rival doctors? Did the Prince of Wales have, his physician in there trying to put his advantage?
So he had Dr. Warren, and he was so he sort of became one of the team of doctors that was looking after George III, but really he was looking after the interests of the Prince of Wales. And the king did not want Warren anywhere near him. He knew full well what the Prince of Wales was up to. So he had his own team of doctors, but even then he didn't particularly get on with. His original doctor was Dr. Baker. When it was felt that he couldn't really cope with the situation, the Willises were brought in. The Willises were a couple of brothers, and then also later there's a son who had their own private asylum in the country, and they were thought to be experts in this matter. So they came out, and they were really the ones who kind of imposed this very strict discipline on George, where he was almost punished for bad behavior. So of course George hated this because he was being treated like a child. But there was a very easy way for him to get around it, because he was still the king. They couldn't speak to him without being spoken to first. So if he didn't want to converse with them, he just wouldn't say anything, and then they couldn't ask him any questions. And so he was able to sort of use his position to sort of get around them to a certain extent. Although obviously there were points where he couldn't do that, and he was under restraint.
That's extraordinary. So he has a sort of agency, doesn't he? He has a kind of an intelligence at how to outwit them and to manipulate this absolutely tragic situation that he's in.
Yeah, and he also has a sense of humor as well, which I think is one of the lovely things that comes throughout the documents, is that he's constantly, even when he's really low, he's very often witty and making jokes about things, like the fact that he refers to his chair that he's restrained in as his coronation chair. Like, it's sad, but it shows that there's still a quick mind there to some extent. There was another joke that he had for one of his doctors, was when he found out that he used to be a minister, was that he said to them, you've given up a job I love for one that I hate. And the doctor replied, well, didn't our Lord himself go around healing the sick? And George said, yeah, but he didn't have £700 a year for doing it. So he, he retained this sense of humor.
Yes, yeah.
For most of his life, really. And it's because he was a prolific letter writer, we just have so much of his personality coming through in the documents from that time. So it's amazing.
Did he write letters or a diary when he was ill?
Not when he was really ill, but he, right up until he couldn't really. And actually, that's some of the evidence that we have for looking at things like bipolar are some of the letters that he's written, where it's just these really, really long sentences without any punctuation. It just gives you a sense of how quickly his mind was working, so that he almost couldn't get the words down on the paper quick enough. So that's actually some of the evidence that we have. And then as soon as he sort of regained his health in 1789, he was back to writing letters again. And that's where we have that really sad quote about him thinking that he must have lost some friends, which he wrote to the Prime Minister. So yes, there's a lot of evidence for how he was feeling, I guess. And of course, that's only what he was putting down on paper. You can only imagine what he was going through. Personally.
Yeah. Can you say more, when you mentioned the Prime Minister there, and obviously he's using his role as head of state to sometimes manipulate the doctors. Can you say more about, I suppose, both the sort of the political management of his illness? What was the sort of, the palace's comms? What was their PR saying?
Yeah.
And also the political consequences.
Yeah, so I think the main communication that the palace had with Parliament were these daily bulletins, as I say, which were released by this team of doctors. But because the doctors were so at odds with each other and so unable to agree, they were very vaguely worded and really of not much use at all. And so this obviously was a constitutional monarchy, but the king was still very important in it. And so he had to be there to open Parliament. He had to be there to sign all these documents. So if he wasn't doing any of that, then something had to move. But you can see, even at this point in history, there's no suggestion that the Prime Minister would step in and take control. There's very early on, there was a discussion about being Prince Regent and that happening. I think one of the reasons that it didn't happen more quickly in 1788 might have been down to how unpopular George was. George, the Prince of Wales. That was not something that the Parliament or the country really wanted to see. And actually, when George III regained his health in 1789, he was more popular than ever. There was also some talk of the Queen taking on some of his responsibilities, and she was very keen to not do that because she was very apolitical. She was already under a lot of criticism and pressure because she was German and seen as a foreigner. She wasn't a particularly popular queen. And so she knew, I think, that being seen to take on any more political responsibility would just lead to more criticism for her.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can you say more about how their relationship? I mean, do you talk about the other family members too? But I think that relationship with the Queen is fundamentally altered.
Yes.
By his illness. Can you say more about that? It's very sad.
Yeah, it's really sad because he must be certainly the first Georgian, if not the first king, to not have mistresses. And I mean, obviously they had 15 children, so maybe he didn't have time, but they had a very good relationship. It wasn't a love match. He selected her from basically a big book of German princesses, but they had a very good marriage for the first few years, and were apparently a very happy family. One of the things that the king had when he was ill is that he began to imagine that in fact he wasn't married to the Queen anymore and he was married to somebody else. And of course that upset her very much, as well as just some of his violent tempers. She was quite scared of him. They had, up to that point, had always shared a bedroom and shared a bed, but she didn't really want to do that anymore. And you can understand her fear, but also understand how hurt George was by that when he recovered. They really didn't have the same relationship again after that. And although they did reconcile after that first episode, by sort of 1800s, they weren't on particularly good terms and weren't particularly living together anymore. She probably didn't see him at all, if any, after about 1811, 1812, when he went to Windsor. And as I said, he wasn't told when she had died. So you can see in the letters, some of her daughters are almost quite annoyed at her, what they perceive as a lack of understanding of his position and a lack of sympathy towards the king. So you can see that there is a tension there in the family, and actually Princess Elizabeth became almost a point of liaison between the two at certain points. But it was a sad end to what had been a very happy beginning, yeah.
And her own death was very sad itself, wasn't it? Dying alone. And
yes, especially because she kind of had not really intended to come to Kew and was on her way to Windsor, and then had to stop at somewhere that she didn't really particularly want to be, and had, by all accounts, quite a painful death, although her daughter did write that she died with a smile on her face. So perhaps that's something. But I think one of the great achievements that Charlotte had actually was to essentially secure the legacy in her last kind of few months at Kew. She, at that point, they didn't have any grandchildren, despite having 15 children. And she secured the legacy by arranging this double marriage for her sons, Edward and William, at Kew Palace in the summer of 1818. And from that match, or from one of those matches, came Victoria. So although often people think there was this break between the Georgians and the Victorians, in fact, there's not. And it was Charlotte who really organized that. So one of her last kind of acts really was to secure that legacy. And she was able to do that in a way that George hadn't been able to do.
And it's interesting also thinking about how much influence George and Caroline had over Kew, because there are these other buildings and sort of scientific aspects to Kew. I mean, the botanical aspect, the observatory. Who was responsible for those?
Well, it was really started by Princess Augusta, who was George's mother. She was really the one who, after her husband died, really worked with Lord Bute to bring new botanical specimens to Kew, develop, that started to sort of develop the science that was going on there. So the Princess of Wales Conservatory that is at Kew today, that everyone thinks is named after Diana, is actually named after Princess Augusta. And then Charlotte just continued that work as well. She was very interested in botany and brought more specimens to Kew. The flower, the bird of paradise flower, Strelitzia regina, is named after Queen Charlotte. So yeah, she was very heavily involved in all of that development.
And did people think that the beautiful surroundings of Kew, and there's an asylum at Chiswick as well, is there a sense, even in the 18th century, that being in nature was good for people's well-being?
Yeah, certainly one of his doctors talked about the surroundings of Kew being good for his health, the fresh air, the scenery. That was definitely something that people were thinking about. I mean, this is a time where you've got people like Rousseau and Voltaire talking about the kind of wonder of nature and that sort of those sort of ideas. And it's amazing to me that people come to Kew today for the same thing. Mm-hmm. People come to escape the madness of the city and to get away from it all, get back to nature, that sort of thing. So in a way, Kew has the same purpose now that it did 200 years ago.
And he continued playing his flute, didn't he? Was that seen as a kind of music therapy? Because it's funny because the ability to play the flute is this sort of very technically advanced skill. Mm. And he also had a very difficult flute, didn't he, to play? And so for him to continue playing his flute when he was ill, it's quite an achievement, isn't it?
Yes.
Was he still able to play it when he was very severely ill? Do you think?
We do know that he did play the flute whilst he was at Windsor. So in that time where he was considered unfit to rule, he could still play the flute. If people want to see this flute, it is amazing. If you go on the HRP website, it's an amazing kind of porcelain flute with this floral decoration. It's absolutely beautiful. We had it in the exhibition last year. But he was a very accomplished musician and he was very musical. He threw concerts all throughout his life. And I suppose it was something that you have been doing your whole life and really love. Sometimes those skills can stay with you even when other things seem like they've gone. So that was certainly something that I think he found, it was almost like self-soothing, I think.
Mm. And what about his family members? Were they, I mean, I'm thinking of the three princesses who pretty much were in a way locked up with him. Did they find things to occupy themselves? Did they enjoy listening to their father playing the flute all day?
Well, they were all very, as most kind of aristocratic young women in those days were, very sort of accomplished, I think is the word. I think Princess Elizabeth is probably the standout one creatively. She was very into her creative design and interior design, actually. So she did all the interior design at Queen Charlotte's cottage, and we think that she might have actually painted some of the floral decoration herself and actually decorated the print room by cutting out Hogarth prints and pasting them onto the wall. So very, creative and artistic. And yeah, they were all taught painting. They were all taught that thing, where you cut out the silhouette with a pair of scissors.
Yes,
that sort of thing. So yeah, they were all doing things like that. And we had at Kew this year some of the technological things that they were able to do, which isn't very technological, but things like the fringe loom that we have a spinning wheel, that sort of thing. That was kind of as advanced as women of that rank could really get in terms of technology. So plenty of things to occupy their time, but certainly when they were waiting for news at Kew of their father, they didn't like it, and they actually referred to it as the nunnery.
Yes, and they never married, did they? I mean, they died young, didn't they? But they was Charlotte busy making matches for them?
Well, it's all different actually. Many of them didn't marry until quite late. So I think, for example, Charlotte, the eldest daughter, I think was in her 30s when she married. Elizabeth was in her 40s when she married, so quite late on. And I think part of that was their mother, after George being ill, really just wanting to keep them close to her, for companionship and support, and so being quite reluctant to let them go. They knew that they weren't going to be able to marry English nobles, because George felt that was going to cause too much division within the country. So their only choice was really foreign princes, which would mean, of course, them leaving the country. And so their mother was quite against that. So yeah, a lot of them had marriages later on in life, which is quite unusual for.
I mean, do you think because of the stigma of mental illness that foreign families didn't want to entrust their royal blood to the offspring of George III?
That's a good question. I don't know. I haven't even considered that. That's a good question. It might be, but I think it certainly seems to me from Charlotte's letters and diaries and their letters that it's more forces at home keeping them at home, rather than them not being wanted elsewhere.
Yeah. Because I mean, even now, somebody's remarked that you can't quite imagine. I can imagine. As there is in the current royal family, discussions of problems with mental health, but to have a head of state who is recognizably suffering from a bipolar disorder, it's a big stretch, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And this is on a different topic, because it is quite dark material, isn't it? I mean, it's we're dealing with something which is a real source of distress for a lot of people, and there've been some lovely comments in the chat, and certainly the feedback that you've had for the exhibition is just how sensitively and thoughtfully you've dealt with this, that the way in which you've been able to accommodate different views and different experiences of mental ill health. It's also been very striking to me that how this King George III, who's known as the Mad King, is the king who lost the Americas, as the father, the dodgy regent, that in some ways the new attitude to his mental health has been a way in to somebody who was a slightly embarrassing bit of our history. And we have a new biography, don't we, of George III. Somebody's asked what's the best biography of George III, and somebody else has asked a question about the new biography by Andrew Roberts, which has just come out and has just been serialized on Radio 4. But I wondered if you wanted to talk either about historical sources, historical studies that you found useful that you'd recommend, or maybe this larger topic of the past and present.
Yes, I think that in terms of books, when our hosts start at Kew, because we have a seasonal team that comes in, they ask us what should we read, and we always recommend the book annoyingly titled Princesses by Flora Fraser and The Strangest Family. And neither of them sound like they're George III biographies, but and that's in a way they're really a biography of the whole family. I think that's really important in understanding that experience, because it did impact his family, and it did impact Charlotte, and it isn't really just the story of one man. And I think that anybody who has had somebody in their family or a friend who was dealing with a mental illness will know that it isn't ever just about one person. So I think that it's nice to consider it in that context, and they're both great books. The Strangest Family in particular is fantastic, and a good sort of ride through of the reign.
Yeah, and the Hanover family was a very strange family anyway, even notwithstanding this mental ill health. But George first hated his son and vice versa, and there was a Frederick, Prince of Wales, died, and so there seems to have been kind of what we could call bad blood between each of the generations.
Yes, and the only ones that weren't like that were Frederick and George III, which is so sad in a way that and maybe if Frederick had become king, obviously he died quite early, maybe that would have ended up in conflict, because that must be a difficult relationship to manage. But actually the relationship as it was very good. And one of the really lovely objects that we had on display this year was a letter from Frederick to George. Essentially, it's instructions on how to be a good king. And it's lovely. The things that it sort of talks about, being a good king is like being a good head of the family, that sort of thing. And so I think George took that very seriously. You can tell in how he manages his kingship that he takes those words very seriously. One of the recommendations from Frederick is also that he should hold on to America. And of course, George isn't able to do that. And I think that in that document, we can really see some of the pressure starting to build on George, that, if you're somebody who is very sensitive and very diligent and has this, much loved father who's died early, and he's giving you these instructions and you can't carry it through, what is that going to do to your sense of self? Mm-hmm. And so I think we can see some of those early indicators of what is to come in that document, as nice as it is.
And so George III is sort of trying to, well, there's that attempt to make Frederick a good king, but does George III have any, or tell us more about the relationship with George IV, and yeah. Does he make any effort to bring George IV into line?
I think he, as a father, is very, he's very strict, and he lives his life in a very kind of modest, frugal way. And, there's reports at one point that the French royal family are laughing at the Hanoverians because they make all their own clothes, and they can't believe, how ridiculous that is. So they're not known for having lavish banquets. They do try and live their lives very simply. He's always worried about putting on weight. He's always worried about spending. The way that he runs his life is just so different from how George IV then runs his life, that you can just see how immediately he's going to rebel against that. And so those completely different attitudes to life, to all areas of life, women, alcohol, food, interior design, spending, everything. Maybe George went too far one way, and George IV then overcorrected. But yeah, certainly it wasn't a good relationship. And I think particularly after how the Prince of Wales acted in that first episode of ill health, where he really was trying to take the power off of his father, that certainly soured relations between them. However, we do know, just to one point in George IV's favour, is that he was very kind to his mother, apparently, and sort of was looking after her and arranging, he arranged all the bedrooms for the princesses when they came to see her at Kew, and he was there, in the last days of her life. And so we know that relationship was quite good at the end.
And did Queen Charlotte actually live in Queen Charlotte's cottage? Is that?
Well, nobody did, no. I would like to, if any of my bosses are listening. But no, Queen Charlotte's cottage is essentially actually a visitor this weekend described it as a glorified Wendy house, which essentially it is. It was never intended to be lived in. It is a summer house, I guess, that you can go down and enjoy that area of the gardens. And we know that they went down there and had picnics and had tea. Actually, after the double wedding that I talked about at Kew Palace, they went down there and for tea. And it didn't have any bedrooms or it didn't really have a kitchen even. It was just a sort of room for preparing food. And then the bottom floor was a print room, as I mentioned. So Elizabeth was displaying Hogarth prints in that room, and we still have some today there as well. And the top room is this beautiful green room with this canopy roof of painted flowers, which, as I said, we think that she might have actually painted. And so the idea is that if you're outside and it starts raining, you can come into this room that is almost as good as being outside. So it was never really lived in as a sort of house. It's called Queen Charlotte's Cottage because she commissioned it, and she got that land as part of her marriage arrangement.
Right. So it's a sort of a really curious inversion of Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon at Versailles, where she lived out her fantasy. So you've got King George III, who's known, he has one of his nicknames is Farmer George, isn't it? Yeah. And he introduces merino sheep.
Yes.
Country, and he sort of husbands his land in a way which is very like a wise farmer.
Yes, and the cottage is so interesting as well. It is that cottage orm thing, but it's the outside of it is meant to look so rustic and so cheap that some of the beams of wood on the outside actually have Roman numerals on them, which is designed to make it look as if it's been kind of put together, because at one point you could buy a sort of ready-made cottage that you would then put together. It was a very cheap way of building a house, but that's not how this cottage was built. Those Roman numerals were put there afterwards to make it look like it's cheaper than it actually is.
It looked like it came from IKEA.
Yeah, so there's almost like this sort of like cosplay of being poor going on.
Yes,
and I just get the feeling that George and Charlotte probably would have been a lot happier if they were just farmers, you know, and didn't have this responsibility of the kingdom on their shoulders.
Yes. So on the one hand, you've got George III kind of using his power when it suits him, as this quite clever way of gaining some control over his treatment. But on the other hand, slipping away from power seems very attractive.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's something where, although he might have been happier in another life, his sense of responsibility is such that he can't, you know, he could never think of giving that up, that sort of thing.
Yeah, abdication is
although we know now that he did consider abdication at one point, don't we? Because there was a letter that came out and just after he lost America that he had considered, which I think just shows you how traumatic that loss was, that failure that he felt he'd delivered, that he would consider such a thing.
So what memory of George III would you like to leave us with? Because this idea that, you know, the loss of America, this loss of his mind, really, such sad facts. Is there something that you'd like us to take away? Something different from that?
Yeah, I think well, the first thing is that, you know, what we really tried to show in the exhibition is that this is really a very complex mind. He had lots of different interests. You know, could have even been considered a genius in certain regards. Had this real kind of polymath mind, and yet has come to be defined by this thing that went wrong in his head, and that's a great shame. And I think that it's important to remember that, as with anybody who's going through mental illness, there's a lot more to them than that. I think the thing about Kew Palace is, although, you know, a lot of these stories are very sad, we have to remember that every family kind of ends sadly because everybody dies in the end.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that it was a sad family or that it's a sad house. And I never feel like Kew Palace, and if people have been there, they might agree or disagree. I don't ever feel like it has a sad feeling to it. So I think remembering kind of the later moments in life is always a good thing as well. And so I like to always emphasize his humor and his wit and the things that have sort of made me laugh as I've been researching him.
Good. Thank you so much, Rachel. It was a wonderful tour. One of the audience members just said that you don't get a sad feeling in the palace.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a joyful place. Wonderful to bring it to life for us. It is going dark for a while. It is the palace is going to be closed. But if you'd like to support the work of the palace, please donate. There are details on the Kew Palace website, but also on the Luminaries website. And also, if you want to work more closely yourself, if you want to find out more about how the place runs and you want to contribute personally, you can volunteer to help out as one of the wonderful guides. So Rachel has just put up for us the slide with further information. I do love this. To support Kew Palace, you can donate by text. Text George 3 to donate £3. I was thinking if you want to support Alexander Pope, you could text Pope 1744, the date of his death. You think you pitched it too low with 3. But thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to all of you, a wonderful audience with such a great range of questions. Thank you so much indeed. Do listen in to our next talks. Our next talk is tomorrow, and that's on Garrick's Temple. That's going to be a real treat. And we have 5 talks till the end of this series, and the next series begins in January. Do come and listen to us again. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.